In the shadowed corridors of power, where ambition meets reality and dreams collide with harsh truths, there exists a fundamental principle that separates the conquered from the conquerors. The man who has already destroyed his weak self possesses an armor that no external force can penetrate. This is not merely philosophical rhetoric, it is the bedrock upon which all lasting power is built. Consider Marcus, a young executive who once trembled at board meetings, his voice barely audible when presenting quarterly reports. His colleagues dismissed him, his superiors overlooked him, and his subordinates questioned his authority. Yet within the span of 18 months, this same man transformed into someone whose mere presence commanded respect, whose decisions were executed without question, and whose strategic vision guided an entire corporation. The transformation did not occur through external circumstances, no promotion handed him power, no mentor opened doors, no lucky break changed his fortune. Instead, Marcus understood and applied the most fundamental truth of power dynamics. True strength emerges only when one has systematically eliminated every weakness within themselves. The weak self is not simply a collection of bad habits or character flaws, it is a comprehensive system of internal vulnerabilities that leave one exposed to external manipulation, control, and destruction. These vulnerabilities manifest in countless ways: the desperate need for approval that makes one compromise their principles for fleeting acceptance, the fear of confrontation that allows others to gradually erode one's boundaries, the attachment to comfort that prevents the necessary risks required for growth, the emotional reactivity that transforms one into a puppet dancing to others' provocations. When Marcus began his transformation, he did not start with grand gestures or dramatic changes. Instead, he initiated a systematic audit of every weakness that made him controllable by others. He identified his desperate craving for his father's approval, which had led him to accept mediocrity rather than risk disappointment. He recognized his fear of financial insecurity, which kept him trapped in positions beneath his capabilities. He acknowledged his need to be liked, which prevented him from making difficult but necessary decisions. The process of destroying the weak self is not about becoming emotionally numb or socially isolated, it is about achieving a state where external circumstances cannot dictate internal responses. It requires developing what philosophers call negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason, without being dependent on external validation or immediate resolution. Marcus's first step involved establishing non-negotiable standards for himself that existed independent of others' opinions or reactions. He committed to arriving at the office before anyone else, not to impress his superiors, but to create a rhythm of discipline that strengthened his internal structure. He began reading extensively in his field, not to gain recognition as knowledgeable, but to build genuine competence that would serve as armor against criticism. He started exercising daily, not for physical appearance, but to develop the mental fortitude that comes from consistently overcoming physical discomfort. Each of these actions served a dual purpose: they eliminated dependencies on external factors while simultaneously building internal resources. When Marcus no longer needed his colleagues' approval, their attempts to manipulate him through praise or criticism lost their power. When he developed genuine expertise, their efforts to undermine his confidence through technical challenges fell flat. When he built physical and mental resilience, their attempts to overwhelm him with pressure and stress proved ineffective. The transformation accelerated as Marcus began to understand that every weakness he eliminated made him proportionally more powerful in his interactions with others. His former need for approval had made him predictable. Colleagues knew they could influence his decisions by offering or withdrawing social acceptance. Once he eliminated this need, his actions became guided by strategic considerations rather than emotional reactions, making him unpredictable and, therefore, more formidable. His previous fear of confrontation had trained others to push boundaries, knowing he would eventually capitulate to avoid conflict. When he developed comfort with confrontation, not aggression, but the calm willingness to engage in difficult conversations, colleagues began treating him with increased respect and caution. They could no longer rely on his conflict avoidance to get their way. The weak self operates through a system of dependencies that create leverage points for others to control us. Every emotional need that requires external fulfillment becomes a vulnerability that sophisticated opponents will exploit. Every fear that drives our decisions becomes a tool in their hands. Every attachment that we cannot bear to lose becomes a weapon they can wield against us. Marcus discovered that destroying the weak self required more than simply identifying these vulnerabilities, it demanded replacing each dependency with internal resources. Instead of needing others to validate his ideas, he developed the analytical skills to evaluate them objectively. Instead of requiring external motivation, he cultivated internal drive systems based on long-term vision rather than immediate gratification. Instead of depending on others for emotional support, he built psychological resilience through disciplined practices that maintained his equilibrium regardless of external circumstances. The process is neither quick nor comfortable. It requires confronting aspects of oneself that are easier to ignore or rationalize. It demands replacing familiar patterns with new behaviors that initially feel unnatural. It necessitates accepting short-term social costs. Some people will be confused or even threatened by the changes in exchange for long-term strategic advantages. Marcus faced significant resistance, not only from his own psychological patterns but from colleagues who had grown comfortable with his predictable weaknesses. When he stopped seeking approval, some interpreted this as arrogance. When he began setting firm boundaries, others labeled him difficult. When he started making decisions based on strategic rather than social considerations, certain colleagues accused him of becoming cold. This resistance served as validation that the transformation was working. The people who benefited from his weaknesses naturally opposed changes that eliminated their ability to control him. Their discomfort indicated that he was successfully removing the leverage points they had previously used to influence his behavior. The destroyed weak self is replaced not by hardness or cruelty, but by what can be described as strategic authenticity, a state where one's actions align with long-term objectives rather than immediate emotional impulses or social pressures. This creates an internal consistency that others find both attractive and intimidating. When someone's behavior becomes predictably aligned with their stated principles rather than their momentary feelings, they develop a reputation for reliability that translates into increased influence and respect. Marcus began to notice that his colleagues approached him differently as his transformation progressed. Where they had once dismissed his input, they now listened carefully to his perspectives. Where they had once pushed boundaries, they now respected his positions without testing them. Where they had once excluded him from important discussions, they now actively sought his involvement. This shift occurred not because he had become more aggressive or demanding, but because he had become more formidable through the elimination of weaknesses. His opinions carried weight because they were no longer influenced by the need for approval. His decisions commanded respect because they were based on strategic analysis rather than emotional reactions. His presence inspired confidence because others recognized that he could not be easily manipulated or controlled. The foundation of Inner Fortress is built through the systematic identification and elimination of every internal vulnerability that creates external leverage points. It requires developing internal resources to replace external dependencies. It demands maintaining consistency between stated principles and actual behavior regardless of immediate social costs. Most importantly, it necessitates understanding that true power comes not from the ability to control others, but from the achievement of a state where others cannot control you. When Marcus reflected on his transformation 18 months later, he realized that becoming untouchable had required nothing more and nothing less than destroying every aspect of himself that made him touchable. The weak self that had once made him vulnerable to manipulation, criticism, and control had been systematically replaced by internal structures that generated power from within rather than seeking it from without. This process of internal destruction and reconstruction forms the foundation upon which all subsequent strategic development must be built. Without this foundation, even the most sophisticated strategies and tactics will ultimately fail because they rest upon internal vulnerabilities that others can exploit. With this foundation in place, however, even simple strategies become devastatingly effective because they are executed by someone who cannot be deterred, manipulated, or controlled through conventional means. Part 2. The architecture of strategic discipline. The destruction of the weak self creates a vacuum that must be filled with something far more powerful, a systematic approach to life that transforms every action into a strategic move in a larger game. This is where discipline transcends its common understanding as mere self-control and evolves into what military strategists call force multiplication, the ability to achieve disproportionate results through systematic application of focused effort. Elena discovered this principle during her most challenging period as a startup founder. Her company was hemorrhaging money, key investors were losing confidence, and her team was beginning to question her leadership. Competitors were circling like vultures, sensing weakness and preparing to poach her best talent. In that moment of crisis, she faced a choice that would define not only her company's future but her understanding of power itself. She could react emotionally to each crisis as it emerged, or she could develop a systematic approach that would transform apparent weakness into strategic advantage. The architecture of strategic discipline begins with a fundamental recognition: every moment of every day presents opportunities to either strengthen or weaken one's position. Most people experience life as a series of random events to which they must react. Those who understand strategic discipline recognize that life is actually a continuous stream of choices, each of which moves them closer to or further from their objectives. Elena began by implementing what she called the 3 layers of strategic discipline. The first layer involved daily practices that built internal resources regardless of external circumstances. The second layer consisted of systematic approaches to decision-making that prioritized long-term strategic value over short-term emotional satisfaction. The third layer encompassed the development of systems that would function effectively independent of her constant attention and intervention. The first layer, daily practices, required Elena to establish routines that strengthened her capacity to think clearly and act decisively under pressure. She implemented a morning routine that began at 5 a.m. with 30 minutes of strategic planning, during which she reviewed her long-term objectives and identified the 3 most important actions she could take that day to advance them. This was followed by 45 minutes of physical exercise designed not primarily for health benefits, but to develop comfort with sustained discomfort, a critical skill for maintaining strategic thinking under stress. After exercise, Elena spent 20 minutes reading material completely unrelated to her immediate business challenges. This practice served multiple strategic purposes. It prevented her thinking from becoming too narrow and industry-focused. It exposed her to mental models and frameworks from other domains that could be applied to her situation, and, most importantly, it demonstrated to her subconscious mind that she was not desperate or panicked, but rather approaching her challenges with the confidence of someone who had time to continue learning and growing. These morning practices created what Elena termed daily wins, achievements that were entirely under her control and that reinforced her sense of agency and capability before she engaged with the unpredictable challenges of business. By 7 a.m. each morning, she had already accomplished 3 meaningful objectives, creating a psychological foundation of success that colored her approach to everything that followed. The second layer, systematic decision-making, required Elena to develop frameworks that would guide her choices when emotions ran high and immediate pressures demanded quick responses. She created a decision matrix that evaluated every choice against 4 criteria: strategic alignment with long-term objectives, resource efficiency, competitive advantage creation, and team development impact. When a major client threatened to cancel their contract unless she reduced prices by 30%, Elena's emotional impulse was to agree immediately to preserve the relationship and maintain cash flow. However, her strategic framework demanded that she evaluate the decision against her 4 criteria. Strategic alignment, accepting would establish a precedent that her services were negotiable, undermining her positioning with other clients. Resource efficiency, the reduced margin would strain her operations while providing the same service level. Competitive advantage, capitulating would signal weakness to competitors and clients alike. Team development, agreeing would demonstrate to her team that principles could be abandoned under pressure. Instead of accepting the client's demand, Elena presented 3 alternative proposals: a reduced service package at the requested price point, a longer contract term at a smaller discount, or a referral fee arrangement where the client would help her secure additional business in exchange for pricing concessions. This approach transformed a situation where she appeared to have no choice into one where she controlled the options available to the client. The client chose the longer contract term option, which actually improved Elena's strategic position by providing cash flow predictability and demonstrating to other clients that her pricing reflected genuine value rather than desperation. More importantly, the process reinforced her confidence in systematic decision-making under pressure and established her reputation as someone who could find creative solutions rather than simply accepting unfavorable terms. The third layer, systematic approaches, required Elena to build operational structures that would continue advancing her strategic objectives even when her attention was required elsewhere. She developed what she called autonomous strategic systems, processes that would strengthen her competitive position without requiring her constant oversight. One such system involved establishing a monthly learning initiative where each team member was required to master a skill outside their immediate job function and teach it to the rest of the team. This system served multiple strategic purposes. It developed her team's capabilities, making them more valuable and less likely to be poached by competitors. It created a culture of continuous improvement that attracted high-quality talent. It generated cross-functional knowledge that made the company more resilient and adaptable, and it positioned Elena's company as an industry leader in professional development. Another autonomous system involved systematic relationship building with potential clients, partners, and industry influencers. Rather than networking reactively when she needed something, Elena implemented a proactive relationship maintenance system that added value to her network continuously. She created a database of key relationships with notes on each person's current challenges, objectives, and interests, and established a routine of reaching out monthly with relevant resources, introductions, or insights. This systematic approach to relationship building meant that when Elena did need support, whether for funding, partnerships, or advice, she was drawing upon a bank of goodwill that she had been building systematically rather than asking for favors from people she only contacted when she needed something. The difference in response was dramatic. People eagerly supported someone who had been consistently valuable to them over time, while they avoided those who only appeared when they needed help. The architecture of strategic discipline creates what military strategists call compound advantages, small systematic improvements that accumulate over time to produce dramatic shifts in competitive position. Elena's daily practices built her capacity to think clearly under pressure. Her systematic decision-making ensured that short-term choices supported long-term objectives. Her autonomous systems continued strengthening her position even when she was focused on immediate challenges. Within 12 months, Elena's systematic approach had transformed her company's trajectory. The daily practices had developed her reputation as an unusually thoughtful and prepared leader, which attracted higher quality clients and team members. The systematic decision-making had created a track record of creative problem-solving that differentiated her from competitors who simply accepted conventional industry limitations. The autonomous systems had built operational capabilities and market relationships that made her company increasingly difficult for competitors to challenge. The transformation was particularly evident in how others interacted with Elena. Where clients had once pressured her for concessions, they now approached her as a strategic partner whose insights could benefit their businesses. Where competitors had once viewed her as vulnerable prey, they now treated her as a formidable opponent whose moves required careful analysis. Where team members had once questioned her leadership during difficult periods, they now had confidence in her systematic approach to challenges. Strategic discipline differs fundamentally from conventional self-discipline in its focus on systems rather than willpower, long-term positioning rather than immediate results, and strategic advantage creation rather than simple task completion. It requires understanding that every action either builds or diminishes one's strategic position, and that systematic approaches consistently outperform reactive responses over time. Elena's success demonstrated that strategic discipline is not about perfection or never making mistakes, it is about having systems that learn from failures and continuously improve performance. When one of her key employees left for a competitor, her systematic approach to team development meant she had already been building bench strength and cross-training capabilities. When a major client reduced their contract, her systematic relationship building meant she had warm prospects already in the pipeline. The architecture of strategic discipline creates what economists call antifragility, the property of systems that become stronger under stress rather than merely surviving it. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to demonstrate and strengthen systematic approaches rather than simply a problem to be overcome. Each crisis validates the importance of systematic preparation rather than revealing weaknesses in one's approach. This systematic approach to life creates a form of power that others find difficult to understand or counter. It appears to be luck or natural talent, when it is actually the result of systematic preparation meeting opportunity. It seems effortless, when it is actually the product of tremendous disciplined effort applied systematically over time. Most importantly, it appears unpredictable to opponents, when it is actually highly predictable based on consistent principles applied through systematic frameworks. The architecture of strategic discipline transforms daily life from a series of reactions into a continuous process of strategic positioning.
It creates compound advantages that accumulate over time.
It builds systems that function independently of constant oversight. Most importantly, it establishes foundations for power that cannot be easily challenged or replicated by those who lack the patience and discipline to build their own systematic approaches. Part 3: The Mastery of Untouchable Power. The culmination of destroying the weak self and building strategic discipline is the achievement of what ancient philosophers called ataraxia, a state of unshakable tranquility that renders one immune to external manipulation while maximizing one's ability to influence outcomes. This is not the cold detachment of the sociopath or the rigid control of the authoritarian, but rather the flexible strength of someone who has developed internal resources sufficient to meet any external challenge. David embodied this principle during his tenure as CEO of a multinational corporation facing simultaneous crises that would have destroyed leaders who depended on external circumstances for their confidence and effectiveness.
A global recession was decimating revenues across all divisions.
Regulatory investigations threatened massive fines and potential criminal charges against senior leadership. Key competitors were launching coordinated attacks designed to capture market share during the company's vulnerable period.
Internal resistance to necessary restructuring was creating operational paralysis.
Media coverage had turned relentlessly negative, affecting both employee morale and customer confidence. Most CEOs in such circumstances become reactive, moving frantically from crisis to crisis, making increasingly desperate decisions as pressure mounts.
They seek external validation through consultant recommendations, board approval, or media management. They attempt to control outcomes through increasingly aggressive tactics that often backfire by revealing their desperation.
They burn through their credibility and political capital in rapid succession as each reactive decision creates new problems requiring additional reactive responses.
David's approach demonstrated the practical application of untouchable power.
Rather than reacting to external circumstances, he used them as opportunities to demonstrate and strengthen the systematic approaches he had developed over years of disciplined preparation. Rather than seeking external validation, he relied on internal frameworks that had proven their effectiveness through previous challenges. Rather than attempting to control outcomes directly, he focused on controlling his responses to ensure they aligned with long-term strategic objectives regardless of immediate pressures. The first principle of untouchable power is the recognition that external circumstances are never the primary determinant of outcomes. Internal responses to external circumstances determine results. David understood that his company's survival and eventual prosperity would depend not on the external challenges disappearing, but on his ability to respond to them in ways that strengthened rather than weakened the organization's strategic position. When the regulatory investigation intensified, David's competitors expected him to become defensive and distracted, allocating significant time and resources to legal maneuvering and public relations management. Instead, he used the investigation as an opportunity to implement operational improvements that exceeded regulatory requirements and positioned the company as an industry leader in compliance and transparency. Rather than simply responding to regulatory demands, he proactively addressed systemic issues throughout the industry that regulators had not yet identified, creating competitive advantages while simultaneously reducing legal risks. This approach transformed a defensive situation into a strategic opportunity. Media coverage shifted from criticism of the company's past practices to recognition of its industry-leading reforms. Competitors who had expected to gain advantage during the company's distraction found themselves scrambling to match compliance standards that David's company had already implemented. Regulators who had approached the investigation as enforcement action began viewing the company as a partner in improving industry practices. The second principle of untouchable power involves leveraging others' attempts to control or manipulate you into opportunities to strengthen your position. When David's competitors launched their coordinated attack, they expected him to respond competitively by cutting prices, increasing marketing expenditures, or offering aggressive incentives to prevent customer defection. These reactive responses would have validated their strategy while weakening his company's financial position during an already challenging period. Instead, David used the competitive pressure as motivation to accelerate innovation initiatives that had been under development. Rather than competing on the terms his opponents had chosen, price and marketing intensity, he shifted the competitive landscape by introducing new products and services that made their offerings obsolete. The resources they had allocated to attacking his existing business became wasted investments as he redefined the market around capabilities they had not developed. This approach demonstrated the strategic principle that the best defense is often a redefinition of the competitive space rather than direct competition within existing parameters. By refusing to accept his competitors' framing of the battle, David transformed their attack into an opportunity to establish leadership in emerging market segments while they remained focused on commoditized existing markets. The third principle of untouchable power requires developing the ability to find opportunity within every apparent setback or constraint. When the global recession reduced demand across all of David's company's traditional markets, conventional wisdom suggested cost-cutting, workforce reductions, and operational consolidation to survive the downturn. While these measures were indeed necessary, David implemented them as part of a broader strategic repositioning rather than simply reactive survival tactics. He used the recession as an opportunity to acquire distressed competitors at favorable prices, emerging from the downturn with increased market share and enhanced capabilities. He leveraged reduced real estate costs to establish operations in strategic new markets that had previously been too expensive to enter. He took advantage of available talent as other companies downsized to build capabilities in emerging technology areas that would drive future growth. Most importantly, he used the external pressure of the recession to drive internal changes that had been necessary for years but had faced organizational resistance during prosperous times. The crisis created urgency that enabled him to implement operational improvements, eliminate inefficient processes, and restructure underperforming divisions without the usual political obstacles. The fourth principle of untouchable power involves maintaining strategic patience while others succumb to pressure for immediate results. As David's systematic approach began producing positive outcomes, external stakeholders, investors, board members, media analysts demanded increasingly aggressive actions to accelerate recovery. They wanted dramatic announcements, bold acquisitions, revolutionary strategic pivots that would create immediate excitement and rapid stock price appreciation. David's response demonstrated the discipline required for untouchable power. Rather than allowing external pressure to compromise his systematic approach, he continued executing his strategic plan while communicating progress in ways that maintained stakeholder confidence without creating unrealistic expectations. He understood that sustainable power requires building foundations that will support long-term success rather than creating short-term excitement that cannot be maintained. This patience proved strategically advantageous when competitors who had pursued dramatic quick-fix strategies began experiencing the inevitable failures that result from unsustainable approaches. While they were managing the fallout from overly aggressive moves, David's company was building market position through systematic execution of well-considered strategies. The fifth principle of untouchable power requires developing the capability to influence outcomes while remaining personally unattached to specific results. David discovered that his effectiveness increased dramatically when he focused on executing strategies optimally while accepting that external factors beyond his control would partially determine actual outcomes. This paradoxical approach, maximum strategic effort combined with emotional detachment from results, created several advantages. It enabled him to evaluate situations objectively without the cognitive biases that result from ego investment in particular outcomes. It allowed him to adapt strategies quickly when circumstances changed without the psychological resistance that comes from admitting previous approaches were no longer optimal. It made him more persuasive with stakeholders because they sensed his genuine commitment to optimal outcomes rather than personal agenda advancement. The mastery of untouchable power ultimately creates what systems theorists call emergent properties, capabilities that arise from the integration of multiple components but cannot be predicted from understanding individual elements. David's systematic destruction of internal weaknesses, combined with his disciplined strategic approach and his mastery of influence principles, created a leadership presence that others found compelling but could not easily replicate or counter. His board members found themselves consistently supportive of his recommendations not because they always agreed with his analysis, but because his track record of systematic thinking and strategic patience had earned their trust. His employees followed his leadership not because they feared consequences or sought rewards, but because his consistent principles and strategic focus created confidence in the organization's direction. His competitors found their traditional tactics ineffective not because David was more aggressive or better resourced, but because he operated from systematic frameworks they could not predict or counter. The 18 months following David's initial crisis period validated the practical effectiveness of untouchable power. The company not only survived the multiple crises but emerged in a stronger competitive position than before they occurred. Revenue and profitability exceeded pre-crisis levels despite continuing economic challenges affecting the industry. Market share increased significantly as competitors struggled with the consequences of reactive strategic choices. Employee engagement and retention improved as the organization's systematic approach to challenges created confidence in leadership and direction. More significantly, David's personal reputation evolved from that of a competent manager to an industry leader whose insights and approaches were studied and emulated by other executives. He began receiving offers from larger organizations seeking leaders who could navigate complex challenges while building long-term competitive advantage. His compensation increased dramatically as his board recognized that his systematic approach had created value that could not be easily replaced. The mastery of untouchable power does not make one invulnerable to external challenges or guarantee specific outcomes in particular situations. Instead, it creates a systematic capability to respond to any challenge in ways that strengthen rather than weaken one's strategic position over time. It builds internal resources that function independently of external validation or support. It develops influence capabilities that operate through attraction rather than force, creating sustainable rather than temporary compliance. Most importantly, the mastery of untouchable power creates a form of freedom that few people ever experience, the freedom to act based on strategic considerations rather than emotional reactions, social pressures, or external circumstances. This freedom is not licensed to ignore consequences or operate without regard for others, but rather the capacity to choose responses based on thoughtful analysis of long-term implications rather than immediate emotional impulses or social expectations. The man who destroys his weak self through systematic discipline and strategic thinking cannot be destroyed by others because he has eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that others would exploit. He cannot be easily controlled because his decisions arise from internal frameworks rather than external pressures. He cannot be permanently defeated because his systematic approaches learn from failures and continuously improve effectiveness. This is the ultimate achievement of power philosophy, not the ability to dominate others through force or manipulation, but the development of internal resources and systematic approaches that create sustainable influence while remaining unshakable in the face of external challenges. It transforms apparent obstacles into opportunities, setbacks into strategic advantages, and opposition into validation of one's systematic approaches. The journey from weakness to untouchable power is neither quick nor comfortable, but it offers something that no external achievement can provide: the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing one has developed the internal resources and systematic capabilities to meet any challenge life presents. This confidence becomes the foundation for influence that others find compelling but cannot easily understand or replicate, creating sustainable power that grows stronger through application rather than weaker through use. In the final analysis, becoming untouchable through discipline and strategy is not about avoiding challenges or eliminating risks, it is about developing the systematic capabilities to transform any challenge into an opportunity for strategic advancement. The weak self that once made us vulnerable to external manipulation becomes replaced by internal resources that generate power from within. The reactive patterns that once made us predictable to opponents become replaced by strategic frameworks that make us formidable allies and challenging competitors. The dependencies that once gave others leverage over us become replaced by autonomous capabilities that enable us to influence outcomes while remaining personally unshakable regardless of results. This transformation is available to anyone willing to undertake the systematic destruction of their weak self and the disciplined construction of strategic capabilities. It requires patience, consistency, and the courage to replace familiar but limiting patterns with new approaches that initially feel uncomfortable. Most importantly, it demands recognition that true power comes not from controlling others, but from achieving a state where others cannot control you, a state of untouchable strength built through discipline, strategy, and the systematic mastery of one's own internal landscape.